Indianola was once a thriving port city located in Matagorda Bay in Calhoun County. The only port city larger at that time in Texas was Galveston. Unfortunately, Indianola had a very short existence of about 50 years. She was completely wiped out by not one but two devastating hurricanes in 1875 and 1886. This is her story. Indianola was first known as Indian Point. It was founded in August of 1846 by Sam Addison White and William M. Cook. It got its start when German noblemen organized the Adelsverein Society in 1842 for the colonization of Germans in western Texas. Prince Karl of Salms-Braunfels, Commissioner General of the Society, chose a stretch of beach near the point as a landing spot for the German immigrants in 1844. He referred to it as Karl's Haven. He also found New Braunfels as a permanent place of settlement for the German immigrants. Much to their dismay, those first German immigrants in early 1845 learned that no preparations had been made for their arrival. There was no shelter, food, or supplies. There was nothing. They were on their own. At that time, there was also no suitable land for which to place them. Prince Braunfels had not acquired New Braunfels yet, but was still working on it. These early immigrants didn't bring guns with them and were unable to hunt large game. They mainly survived on fish and ducks. The immigrants were living in tents and shacks made of mud and grass for 2 months. They were completely unprepared for the hardships that faced them. Many of them died. Sanitary conditions weren't good. Diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery began to take hold. Hundreds of corpses were buried in shallow graves. The shipments of German immigrants continued to arrive at Indian Point. During the fall, winter, and spring of 1845 and 1846, 5,247 men, women, and children came over. The winter season of 1845-1846 was extremely cold and wet. By this time, Prince Braunfels had left the project and a new commissioner general had taken his place by the name of John Musaba. Musaba was able to secure more land for German immigrants and was responsible for starting Fredericksburg. He proved to be a much better manager and made arrangements for barracks to be built and had acquired tents for the German families to be used as housing, but these shelters were no match for the cold weather. Respiratory diseases began to spread throughout the camp, killing many of them. By March of 1846, Musaba had made arrangements for transportation to move the immigrants to New Braunfels, which proved to be very difficult with all the rain they had recently received. The wagons would sink to the axles in the mud. Progress was slow at best. Some of the immigrants became discouraged and left the wagon trains at Victoria or at other locations along the way. However, the wagons soon became a thing of the past when the Mexican-American War broke out. All available teams and wagons in the state of Texas were in use by the United States military. There was much more money to be made by teamsters through the U.S. government than there was from individuals. Therefore, any available transportation vehicles or draft animals practically disappeared overnight, leaving the German immigrants stranded in some cases. Some of them chose to abandon their belongings and head out on foot rather than remain behind in the overcrowded camps during the summer of 1846. The summer heat only made the situation worse as they were plagued by mosquitoes, green stinging flies, and house flies. There was more outbreaks of disease such as typhoid, cholera, and cerebrospinal meningitis. People were dying faster than they could be buried and had to be buried in mass graves. In some cases, whole families were wiped out. Estimates for the number of people who died during that summer range anywhere from 400 to 1,200. With the onset of the Mexican War, the government sent ships filled with men, supplies, and arms into Matagorda Bay for movement into the frontier. This played a huge role in establishing Indian Point as a commercial port of call in the western Gulf of Mexico. Soon wharves were being built so more ships could dock there. Commercial and passenger traffic grew so much that the U.S. government established a post office there in 1847. The town began to grow quickly. By 1848, Indian Point developed into a wholesale center for merchandise. Items such as groceries, hardware, lumber, clothing, furniture, and other items were readily available. Merchants from inland towns got supplies from there. There was even a weekly stagecoach service started from Victoria to Indianola in 1848. Railroad tracks were also built that linked with the Gulf, West Texas, and Mexican Railway that linked Port Lavaca to Victoria. Charles Morgan built a wharf there as a terminus for his New York steamship line. Immigration from Europe also started to ramp up in 1848. Most of these immigrants who were fleeing from the turmoil of their home countries wanted to settle in western Texas. This brought lots of ships from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pensacola, Mobile, and New Orleans loaded with cargo for the interior of western Texas. Lumber was in big demand there. Cattle was big business and being shipped to New Orleans in 1849 as well. They also took back raw materials designated for the North. Huge warehouses had to be built to temporarily store all of the merchandise going to and from Indian Point. Lots of homes and businesses also began to spring up. The homes were mostly cottages at first until large private homes began appearing in the 1850s. Indian Point was renamed Indianola in 1849 and was the county seat of Calhoun County from 1852 to 1886. The town continued to prosper and grow. There were theaters, hotels, restaurants, and many other businesses. Gas lights were installed throughout the business district. Indianola grew to have 834 building blocks, 64 wharf lots, and outside of the town, 142 farm lots. By 1875, more than 5,000 people lived there. An unusual happening took place in 1856 when 2 government shipments of camels were unloaded at Indianola. The camels were part of an experiment by the U.S. government to see if they could be used to transport military supplies on the frontier of Texas, since they could travel long distances without drinking water in arid regions. The arrival of the camels brought a lot of excitement to the people of Indianola. Everything shut down to observe the camels being loaded off the ship. No one had ever seen a camel before. The sight of them walking through the streets with their native handlers was a scene they wouldn't soon forget. Not only were the people excited, but also the camels were super excited to be back on land after their long journey. Their behavior was exuberant, and they put on quite a show for the townspeople by jumping, kicking, crying out, and breaking halters. The camels were in Indianola for a total of 3 weeks before moving on to their next destination in Victoria. A second shipment of 41 camels arrived in 1857. The experiment was basically successful in western Texas, but the project was abandoned in 1861 when the Civil War broke out. The Confederates used some of the camels for movement of supplies in the frontier. Some were captured by individuals and used as pack animals. Some escaped to the wild where they bred and had offspring. For many years afterward, descendants of these camels could be found in the wild in parts of the southwest and northern Mexico. The Civil War brought a lot of changes to Indianola, especially in the area of commerce. The federal blockade diminished exports and imports to a trickle. Occasionally, a blockade runner was able to slip through, bringing much-needed goods to the area. In the spring of 1862, most business at Indianola came to a halt. By October 1862, the federal fleet anchored nearby. The people of Indianola refused to do business with them by selling them beef. Therefore, Captain William B. Renshaw, commander of the federal fleet, demanded the city to surrender. He allowed time for the evacuation of women and children before the bombardment began. There was a short exchange of fire that followed, killing only 2 Confederates and 1 from the Union side. The capture and looting of Indianola was only for a short time before they left Matagorda Bay. In 1863, Indianola was again seized and occupied by the Federals, this time for much longer. The Union soldiers didn't leave Indianola much except for reconnaissance or to steal large numbers of cattle for fresh beef from privately owned herds. The people felt like prisoners in their own town. The Union soldiers destroyed a lot of the buildings and housing. Any valuables the townspeople owned were taken. The U.S. forces didn't leave until March 15, 1864. The citizens repaired the town as best as they could, but any rebuilding of structures that had been burned would have to wait until the war was over. Lumber was scarce. Many of their buildings had been dismantled for the lumber by both the Confederate and Union armies. The photo is a picture of James Shaw, Jr., who was commander of U.S. forces at Indianola. The federal blockade of Matagorda Bay was lifted on June 24, 1865, by order of President Johnson. The town quickly got back on its feet, mostly because it was the Texas port for government supplies for western Texas as well as for the New Mexico and Arizona territories. Goods, machinery, lumber, and other building materials began to flow through the port of Indianola once more. Passenger and freight traffic also quickly came back. The rebuilding of homes, commercial houses, wharves, and warehouses was done immediately so that there would be employment for those in need of it. However, with Reconstruction came the Army of Occupation. Commissioned officers lived temporarily with the residents of Indianola until housing could be built. There was a large camp on the edge of town where tents were occupied by the non-commissioned officers and men. This time the relations between the occupying forces and townspeople were friendly. The 35th U.S. Infantry, Company B, maintained the post until the end of the Reconstruction era. Because there was no business being conducted during the Civil War, the number of cattle began to increase on the Texas range. Estimates range anywhere from 5 to 8 million head. Therefore, the prices drastically dropped. Cattle became more valuable for their hide and tallow instead of their meat. These circumstances led the way for change in the way of meat preservation. Indianola became known for canned beef. Francis Stabler, an Indianolan, developed a technique for canning raw meat using carbonic acid gas. After the war, shippers were doing heavy business in canned meat, cattle hides, and live cattle. Then in 1869, Indianola was the first port to ship refrigerated beef to eastern ports. Before that, cattle had to be shipped live. Agnes, one of Charles Morgan's steamships, was outfitted with a cold storage vault where 30 beef carcasses were kept on the journey to New Orleans. Beef could now be slaughtered and stored in a refrigerating warehouse before being shipped to other locations. This was a game changer for the world and made beef more affordable for everyone. By the 1870s, Indianola had seen many advancements from the primitive German tent camp that it started from, including the arrival of the steamships, a railroad, gas lighting, mechanical refrigeration, and the telegraph. The people of Indianola could buy anything their hearts desired, including luxury goods. Visitors had access to hotels, restaurants, theaters, and saloons. There was even a photographic studio. The stores even provided free delivery services all over the city. The townspeople could attend public concerts by the Indianola City Brass Band and go to dances. The town had 4 baseball teams that traveled to nearby towns for games. Indianola gained much attention after becoming directly involved in the Sutton-Taylor feud. While in Indianola, William Sutton and Gabriel Slaughter were shot down by James and Bill Taylor while buying tickets for the steamer Clinton headed for Galveston on March 11, 1874. The Sutton-Taylor feud that happened in nearby DeWitt County was the longest and bloodiest feud in Texas history. The trial concerning the murder of William Sutton and Gabriel Slaughter was to be held in September 1875. The trial attracted many visitors from the surrounding counties to Indianola to watch the court case, but it could not have been a worse time to have that many visitors in the town. On the screen is a photograph of Mr. and Mrs. William Sutton. On September 15, 1875, a hurricane began to move into Matagorda Bay that would change so many lives forever. At first, all of the visitors and children were excited to see the crashing waves and rising water in the bay, but they had no idea of the tragedy that was about to unfold. By dawn on September 16, the water had risen higher than it ever had before. It rose so high that water was rushing in torrents through the streets like rivers, undermining the buildings from their solid foundations. The wharves were beginning to break apart into pieces that crashed into the buildings on the shore by noon. The visitors became trapped there because the roads were impassable. Also, the passenger train was inoperable at this time and the track was underwater. People began filling into the courthouse for protection. They soon had to move to the second story to escape the surge of water coming in. After pledging not to escape, prisoners from the jail, including Bill Taylor, were released when the waters rose dangerously high. A loose schooner came ashore and struck the telegraph office, so there was no communication. It was later found 5 miles inland. All day, women and children were put in lifeboats and taken to safer locations. When nightfall came, there were no more rescues and everyone had to shelter in place. The storm continued to increase in intensity during the night. Estimates of the wind gust were 145 to 150 miles per hour. Houses, buildings, and warehouses were being swept away. People were panicking. 75% of all the buildings were gone. The ones that survived were badly damaged. Robert Clark waded through waist-deep water to encourage the sisters from the convent next to his house to come take shelter at his home, which he thought a much safer option. The sisters took him up on his offer. There were 32 taking shelter in his attic as the water continued to rise. The Clark house withstood the hurricane and everyone was saved, but the convent did not fare so well. The exact number of how many people died during the hurricane is not known, but estimates are around 300. Entire families had died. Others had only 1 or 2 survivors. Dead bodies were laying along the beach for 20 miles. Many of them were too badly battered to be recognized. Supposedly, Robert Clark dismantled this home after the hurricane of 1875 and had it rebuilt in Victoria at 317 North Main Street, where it still stands today. It is listed on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places. Other houses were dismantled and moved too. You can learn more about these houses by clicking on the link underneath the title. Galveston received news of the tragedy when Captain Lewis came to port on one of Morgan's steamers. He brought to the editor of the Galveston Daily News a plea from District Attorney W.H. Crane of Indianola that said, "We are destitute. The town is gone. 1/10 of the population are gone. Dead bodies are strewn for 20 miles along the bay. 9/10 of the houses are destroyed. Send us help, for God's sake." Many survivors left to go to Victoria, where they could get help with food and shelter. Nearby towns such as Cuero, Gonzales, New Braunfels, San Antonio, Texana, and Port Lavaca also helped the survivors. Help came from West Texas and Galveston as well. Faraway cities like New Orleans, New York, Chicago, and others sent money and supplies by boat. After the storm of 1875, there was talk of relocating the city to a higher elevation, which would have prevented the deep flooding from occurring again with any future storms. Unfortunately, this is not what happened. It was a costly mistake. In 1886, on August 20th, just 11 years after the last hurricane, Indianola was hit by another one. This time it was even worse. Buildings that had withstood the previous hurricane did not survive this one. Thankfully, the town was not as populated as it was before. The town had been rebuilt, but on a smaller scale. However, this time not only did they have wind and water to deal with, but also fire. The fire originated in the signal office building that was monitoring the weather. It became clear that the building was about to give away, so the occupants decided that evacuation was their only option. Before leaving, Captain Reed made sure the anemograph was screwed down tight so that an accurate reading of the wind velocity could be measured. Fire broke out when an unextinguished kerosene lamp exploded when the building started to come apart. The fire spread very fast from the hurricane winds that were last measured at 102 miles per hour. The hurricane of 1886 had stronger winds but was of a shorter duration. Therefore, there was less water damage done to the town, but the fire did plenty of damage otherwise. Luckily, the loss of life was not as great as it was in 1875. These photos are what was left over after the hurricane and fire. Here are some more photos of the damage done. The photo on the left is of the U.S. Customs House. The railroad tracks were lifted by the storm. The other photo is the site of the U.S. Signal Office in the burnt district. Indianola never recovered from the hurricane of 1886. Soon after, the courthouse was moved to Port Lavaca and the post office was discontinued in 1887. Also, another fire broke out in 1887 that destroyed any remaining places of business. The 15 miles of track from Clark Station to Indianola was also abandoned. It's a sad tale. If you would like to learn about Indianola in more detail, I highly recommend the book Indianola, the Mother of Texas by Brownson Malsh. Most of the material for this presentation was taken from that book. As was mentioned earlier, thousands of immigrants came through the port at Indianola, but no official records were kept. The Victoria Regional History Center at the Victoria College, University of Houston Victoria Library has created a database containing the names and information of some 1,600 immigrants who came in through the Indianola seaport. The Victoria County Historical Commission started this project in 1994. Information was gathered from descendants, printed histories, and the like. The database is searchable and can be accessed through their website. You can also view more historical photographs of Indianola by clicking on Photographs or Image Gallery on the website. Thank you for watching.